You have watched trade agreements die before. You watched NAFTA get called the worst deal in American history. You watched the renegotiation, the midnight phone calls, the political theater. You watched the replacement, USMCA, quietly enter force in July 2020 while most of the world was focused on something else entirely. And nothing catastrophic happened. Prices did not collapse, supply chains did not vanish, the border kept moving. So when someone tells you that USMCA, the agreement governing $1.5 trillion in annual trade between three countries, is approaching its first mandatory review, and that none of the three governments have a coherent plan to save it, your instinct is to file that away under political noise. You have been here before. These things always get extended. Someone blinks. A compromise gets announced. The deal survives. Except this review is not a negotiation. It is a legal mechanism embedded in the agreement itself. A tripwire, not a deadline. And the three governments that must reach consensus by July 1st, 2026 are a United States president who has already imposed 25% tariffs on both neighbors while the agreement is still technically in force. A Canadian prime minister who won his election specifically by promising to resist American economic pressure, and a Mexican president navigating cartel designations, fentanyl diplomacy, and the largest tariff burden any Mexican government has faced in the post-NAFTA era. Nobody has sat down. No joint review committee meeting has been scheduled as of May 2026. No framework for a confirmation has been circulated. Nobody has a plan, and the tripwire has a date. Here's the framework for understanding what happens next. USMCA, known in Canada as CUSMA, in Mexico as TMEC, contains what trade lawyers call a sunset review clause under Article 34.7. Every 6 years, all three governments must affirmatively confirm that they want the agreement to continue. The first such review falls on July 1st, 2026. Confirm. The agreement runs 16 more years. Fail to confirm. A 10-year managed walk toward permanent termination begins. There is no automatic renewal. There is no default extension. The agreement dies unless three governments, with three different domestic political crises, can agree to keep it alive. The anchor number, $1.5 trillion. That is the total annual trade volume between the United States, Canada, and Mexico as of 2023, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. That makes North America the largest integrated trade bloc on the planet, larger than the European Union's internal market, larger than China's domestic economy. But what makes that number genuinely staggering is not the total. It is what lives inside it. A single automobile assembled in Michigan crosses the U.S.-Canada border an average of 7 times during its manufacturing process. According to the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, 2023, 7 crossings, 7 exposures to whatever tariff regime exists on the day USMCA ends. By the end of this, you will understand the mechanics of that ending, and why most analysts, most newsrooms, and most governments are not seeing it clearly. To understand why July 1st is a genuine structural crisis and not a deadline that gets quietly extended, you need to understand how USMCA was designed and what it was designed to replace. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, entered force on January 1, 1994. For 26 years, it governed nearly every cross-border transaction between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And for most of those 26 years, it was debated almost entirely in terms of manufacturing jobs, whether it hollowed out American factory towns or lifted Mexican wages. That debate was real, but it was not the most important thing about NAFTA. The most important thing about NAFTA was structural. NAFTA was a platform, not merely a tariff schedule. A platform for the most sophisticated integrated manufacturing system in human history. One that took 30 years to construct and assumed as its foundational premise that North American borders were semi-permeable for the purposes of commerce. When Trump called NAFTA the worst deal ever made, he was right about one thing. It had serious structural imbalances, but the solution he built in its place contains a mechanism that is now, quietly, precisely, being used to destroy the entire architecture. Here's what almost no one has reported, and it changes everything about how you understand what happens on July 1st. The mechanism that was designed to protect USMCA from bad faith renegotiation is now the exact mechanism being used to dismantle it. And the man who put that mechanism into the agreement is the same man now presiding over its collapse. USMCA was signed in November 2018 and entered into force on July 1st, 2020. Trump called it the best trade deal ever made. The replacement for a deal he had called the worst. That phrase, too, aged poorly. The agreement replaced NAFTA's indefinite duration with a fixed 16-year term, reviewable every 6 years. That review clause was designed, according to USTR documentation published in 2018, to prevent any single administration from locking future governments into permanent obligations. The stated logic was coherent. Trade relationships evolve, and no agreement should outlast the political consensus that supports it. But here is what that design produced. It produced a mandatory inflection point, a moment where all three governments must simultaneously confirm, not passively renew, but actively confirm, that the deal continues. And the architects built that moment without accounting for a scenario where the United States government would be the destabilizing actor rather than the stabilizing one. Robert Lighthizer, who served as U.S. Trade Representative under Trump and was the primary architect of USMCA's review mechanism, wrote in his 2023 book, No Trade is Free, "The review clause was designed to keep the agreement responsive to American interests. Renewal was never meant to be automatic." That is not a neutral sentence. That is a policy blueprint, written, published, and now in active deployment. The historical parallel is instructive, and it is not the one most people reach for. In 1860, France and Britain signed the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty, the most consequential trade liberalization agreement of the 19th century. It produced 2 decades of integrated commercial growth across Western Europe. And then the political consensus collapsed. Germany's industrialization threatened French manufacturers. Britain retreated to imperial preference. The treaty was allowed to lapse in 1882. What followed were the tariff wars of the 1880s, a spiral of retaliatory protectionism that trade historians now identify as a primary economic precondition for the continental conflicts that followed. The parallel is not perfect, but the structural signature is identical. Cordell Hull, who served as Roosevelt's Secretary of State and won the 1945 Nobel Peace Prize specifically for his work on trade liberalization, put the logic plainly. Unshackled commerce, punctuated by peace, is the best guarantee of peace that man has yet devised. Hull understood something that the architects of USMCA's review clause appear to have forgotten. The value of a trade agreement is not its text. It is the political will to honor it. That political will, across 3 capitals simultaneously, does not currently exist. Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, has imposed retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion in U.S. goods as of April 2025, according to the Canadian Department of Finance. Mexico, under President Claudia Sheinbaum, is managing a cartel designation process that has complicated every bilateral diplomatic channel with Washington. And the United States has applied 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican steel, aluminum, and a broad range of manufactured goods, while USMCA is still legally in force. That last point deserves a pause. Tariffs are being applied to goods that are supposed to travel duty-free under an agreement that has not yet expired. The agreement is being violated by the country that wrote it, before the review even begins. Here is where the story stops being about governments and starts being about the specific, measurable ways this collapse, if it comes, enters your life. The automobile. It is the most structurally consequential industry in the USMCA framework, and the one most people understand least. USMCA requires that 75% of a vehicle's content be produced in North America for it to qualify for zero tariffs. That threshold, the highest regional content requirement in any major trade agreement currently in force, was the most contested provision in the 2018 negotiations, and it produced over the past 5 years an entirely restructured manufacturing geography. Stellantis, Ford, and General Motors rebuilt supply chains specifically around USMCA's rules of origin. As of 2024, according to the Center for Automotive Research in Ann Arbor, the U.S. auto sector employs 1.07 million workers directly and supports a further 8.3 million jobs in the supplier and dealer network. The supply chains for those jobs cross international borders more than 35 million times per year. This is where your wallet enters the story. Under WTO Most Favored Nation rates, the tariff schedule that applies if USMCA is terminated, automobile imports from Canada and Mexico face tariffs ranging from 2.5% to 25%, depending on classification. Stack that against the existing 25% Section 232 tariffs already applied to steel and aluminum. The National Automobile Dealers Association calculated in March 2025 that a full tariff stack on North American auto imports could add between $4,500 and $9,200 to the average transaction price of a new vehicle. For a country where 85% of new car purchases involve financing, that price increase translates directly into a monthly payment most households are not positioned to absorb. The Federal Reserve reported in Q4 2024 that the average American household carries $17,225 in credit card debt. That is the financial context inside which a $6,000 price increase on a basic vehicle does not stay abstract. Now, the second mechanism. And this one is less visible, which is precisely why it is more dangerous. Energy. Canada supplies 60% of U.S. crude oil imports as of 2023, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. That pipeline flow, from Alberta's oil sands through the Keystone system and related infrastructure, operates under investment frameworks that assume USMCA's Chapter 32 investor protection provisions remain legally intact. If USMCA enters its termination period, those protections begin to erode. Canadian energy producers have begun contingency planning for a scenario where the investment economics no longer function bilaterally. The counterintuitive statistic that makes this concrete. In February 2025, Canadian crude exports to the United States fell by 4.2% in a single month, the largest single-month decline since the COVID lockdowns of April 2020, according to Statistics Canada. The drop was not caused by reduced production. It was caused by deliberate hedging. Canadian producers redirecting supply toward Asian buyers as insurance against U.S. policy volatility. Alberta alone redirected an estimated $2.1 billion in crude in Q1 2025, according to the Alberta Energy Regulator. That is not a financial footnote. That is the beginning of a structural realignment. And once alternative trade routes are established and profitable, they do not reverse easily. The infrastructure gets built, the contracts get signed, the dependency dissolves, and with it, the leverage that makes North American integration valuable for all three parties. This collapse does not affect everyone in the same way. And this is the part that most economic coverage misses entirely. For manufacturing workers in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, the story is about supply chains that cannot be reassembled domestically in under a decade, and about a political promise of industrial revival that cannot be delivered through tariffs on integrated production systems. For consumers across all income brackets, the story is about simultaneous pressure on car prices, grocery costs, and home heating bills, three compression points hitting at the same time. For institutional investors with heavy industrial and energy exposure, the story is about a structural shock to valuations occurring inside a Federal Reserve still managing a $7.6 trillion balance sheet as of April 2026, with limited room to absorb a supply-side price spiral. Here is the part that nobody on television will say plainly, and the reason they will not say it is exactly the reason you need to hear it. What comes next is not a trade story, it is a sovereignty story, and those end differently than trade stories. Historically, consistently, without exception, the official position across all three capitals is that the July 1st review will produce some form of confirmation, amendment, or mutually agreed extension. That is the publicly stated position. Now compare it to the observable reality. The United States Trade Representative's Office has not published a formal USMCA joint review timeline as of May 2026. No joint review committee session has been announced. Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs described bilateral trade talks in April 2026 as difficult and materially incomplete. Mexico's Economy Ministry issued a statement in March 2026 describing the process as proceeding through appropriate diplomatic channels, language which, in diplomatic practice, means the conversations are happening at a level of ambiguity insufficient to produce a concrete outcome. The gap between the announced optimism and the observable paralysis is not a communications problem. It is structural evidence that the political consensus required to confirm the agreement does not currently exist. There are three scenarios from here, and the probabilities are not what financial markets are pricing. Scenario 1, the review confirmation fails. July 1st passes without formal agreement from all three parties. USMCA's 10-year termination period begins. Markets reprice North American industrial and energy assets under a new tariff reality. The auto sector initiates a supply chain restructure. Energy infrastructure enters legal ambiguity under eroding Chapter 32 protections. The Brookings Institution's Trade Analysis Division, in a May 2026 assessment, placed the probability of this scenario at 35 to 40%. That is not a tail risk. That is a near coin flip. Scenario 2, partial confirmation. One or two parties confirm, the third does not. USMCA's Article 34.7 does not clearly specify what happens in this case, because the clause was drafted assuming unanimous participation. A partial confirmation creates a legal ambiguity resolvable only through WTO dispute settlement, a process measured in years, not weeks. During those years, the agreement is technically alive but functionally contested. Investment decisions stall. Supply chain restructuring begins anyway. The legal gray zone is often more economically destructive than a clean termination, because uncertainty is unmanageable in ways that even a bad outcome is not. Probability, 30 to 35%. Scenario 3. A last-minute extension, formal or informal, that defers the review by 12 to 18 months. This is the scenario most market commentators are pricing in. It is also the scenario most dependent on political decisions that have not been made by the people who would have to make them. Probability, 25 to 30%. Before I continue, something deserves a full stop. The North American integrated economy, over the 30 years since NAFTA entered force in 1994, lifted more than 40 million people out of poverty in Mexico. According to World Bank data spanning 1994 to 2022, it created a manufacturing middle class in northern Mexico that did not exist before 1994. In the United States, it underpinned industrial regions whose employment base was entirely restructured around integrated continental production. These are not macroeconomic abstractions. These are real communities, factory workers, logistics workers, engineers, farmers, small business owners, whose livelihoods were built on the specific assumption that the agreements their government signed would hold. When trade economists discuss adjustment costs and supply chain restructuring timelines, they are translating into bloodless language the economic displacement of communities with no margin for error. That cost is not zero. It does not fall evenly, and it tends to arrive before any of the promised corrective mechanisms can be put in place. Now, the historical parallel that matters most. In 1930, the United States Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. The stated intention was to protect American manufacturers from foreign competition. Within 24 months, U.S. international trade had contracted by 66%. 33 countries retaliated with their own tariff schedules. The global trading system contracted so sharply that economic historians now classify Smoot-Hawley not as the cause of the Great Depression, but as the mechanism that converted a financial crisis into a decade-long structural catastrophe. The rational economic case against Smoot-Hawley was overwhelming in 1930. More than 1,000 economists signed a public letter urging President Hoover not to sign the bill. He signed it. The rational case did not matter, because the domestic political logic pointed in one direction. The Congressional Budget Office estimated in April 2026 that the current tariff regime, absent USMCA stabilization, could reduce U.S. GDP growth by 0.8 percentage points annually over the next 5 years. Applied to a compounding base, that is approximately $1.2 trillion in foregone economic output over the period, roughly equivalent to erasing the entire economy of the Netherlands. That figure does not appear in most news coverage of the July 1st deadline. It should be the first number cited, not an afterthought. Step back from the three scenarios for a moment, because here is what all of this, the tariffs, the energy realignment, the auto supply chain, the legal ambiguity, actually tells us about what North America looks like in 2030 if July 1st goes wrong. And that picture is not the one being described anywhere. What I want you to take from this is not alarm. Alarm is not useful here. Alarm paralyzes. What is useful is the map. Because when you understand the actual legal structure of USMCA's review mechanism, the three plausible outcomes, and the specific signals that indicate which direction things are heading, you can see what is coming before the headlines announce it. And in a world changing at this speed, that clarity is the most practical thing you can carry. Now, the counter-argument deserves a full and fair hearing. Because serious analysts with serious credentials look at everything I have just described and land somewhere considerably more composed. Their case is this: North American economic integration is now so structurally deep, so embedded in supply chains, investment frameworks, and corporate balance sheets, that no government, including the current U.S. administration, can allow it to fail without producing catastrophic domestic political consequences. The auto sector alone employs millions of voters in the industrial states that determine U.S. presidential elections. The energy relationship between Canada and the United States is not something that unwinds without immediate, visible consequences for American households. Heating costs in the Northeast, fuel prices in the Midwest. Canadian and Mexican officials have back channels that have not been reported publicly. The rational argument, the optimists say, will eventually assert itself. It always does. Acknowledge what is true in that argument. The economic logic is correct. The integration is real. The political cost of failure is genuinely high. These are not trivial counterweights, but the honest picture, stripped of both panic and complacency, is this: rational economic outcomes have not reliably prevented major trade disruptions when domestic political pressures pointed in a different direction. The WTO's own dispute records show that every major trade war of the past century, including those with the clearest net negative outcomes, was launched by governments that understood the economic cost and proceeded anyway. The rational case for maintaining USMCA has not produced a scheduled review meeting. It has produced press statements, and press statements do not cross borders. Here is what to watch in the weeks ahead. Watch the USTR calendar. If a formal Joint Review Committee meeting is announced before June 15th, that is the single strongest signal that a managed extension, scenario 3, is the working outcome. If no meeting is announced by June 15th, The probability of scenarios 1 or 2 rises sharply, and financial markets will begin pricing that reality before any headline confirms it. Watch Canadian crude export figures. Monthly data from Statistics Canada, released in the third week of each month, will show whether the energy realignment toward Asian buyers is accelerating or stabilizing. Acceleration is an early warning that Canadian producers have stopped treating USMCA stabilization as the base case. That is a structural shift with consequences that extend well beyond the energy sector. Watch U.S. auto sector capital expenditure announcements. Any major declaration, from Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, of a supply chain restructure, a facility relocation, or a production pause, citing trade policy uncertainty, is not a corporate press release. It is the real economy pricing in a post-USMCA world before July 1st arrives. The people who understand what those three signals mean, before the market does, before the commentary catches up, are the people who enter what follows with the most room to navigate. North American integration was 30 years in the making. It does not die in a single day, but it can begin to die on a specific date, through a specific legal mechanism, because specific decisions were not made by specific governments facing specific domestic political pressures. That date has a name, July 1st. The mechanism has a clause number, Article 34.7. The decisions have not been made, and the clock does not negotiate.